Thank you, Renaud. Thank you, President. Let me also say how happy I am to be here to welcome all the friends of the chair, the colleagues who have accepted to be part of this event, of the discussion that's going to follow. Let me say also how honored I am to have been appointed to this chair, because I'm not going to add much to what you already said about Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, about his achievements and his personality. Let me just add two elements that I was really struck by and that I remember vividly. One is his extreme accuracy. You spoke of a rigorous mind, of intellectual sharpness. I think he was unique in being able to capture the essence of the problem and to help define solutions, because he defined the problem so well. And I'm still using some of his really summaries of problems when I speak to my students to tell them about very complex issues in which many people get lost in detail. And he didn't get lost in detail. He summarized the essence of the problem. The other thing I would wish to remember is his dedication. And we were both part of the board of Notre Europe. And when he was appointed minister, having been before appointed chairman of Notre Europe, he continued coming as a minister, chairing the meetings on a Saturday, listening to everyone quietly, and fostering a quality discussion before he summarized at the end. And I don't know many ministers who would have spent Saturdays. He was as busy as everyone, even perhaps more. I don't know many ministers who would have spent Saturdays listening and triggering the discussion and learning from the discussion. So that also was unique. Now, as you said, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa was mostly known as a European, but he was also very much dedicated to the issues of global governance. And he was appointed actually chair of the IMFC, the most important committee of the IMF, the one supposed to be governing the IMF as a Minister of Finance. And he was also before, while at the ECB, in charge of international relations. So that was also a dimension of his work, of his thinking, to which I think we can try to be faithful by working on the issue of global governance. Now, I want to start with a quote of him, in which, that's from his last book, I think, the book in which he give thoughts on a number of things, including on international issues, and criticize very strongly what is known as the own house in order doctrine, according to which there is no international problem to speak of. There are only domestic problems, and if each and every country, each and every government takes care of the domestic problem, the global problems, or the European problems actually, will be solved by themselves. And what he said was quite the contrary, that there are houses, but there is space between the houses, and someone has to take care of the space between the houses. So that's his view, and a good starting point to think about global governance. Now, what do we mean by global governance? And here there are different views, and I think that this shows old quotes from people who worked and contributed significantly to the reflection before the Second World War. One was a jurist, and one was more a sort of public intellectual and historian. The first view is that global governance is essentially about international law, and international law is fundamentally about compulsion. That's Hans Kelsen's view. And the second view, by Norman Angell, who is known for having said that the First World War could not happen because of the degree of interdependence, but nevertheless an interesting person, he described the pre-World War I system of global governance as a sort of disorganized, complex system without a center nor a capital, without an office nor an address, but nevertheless a system that organized international relations. And I think it's fitting today to have those two views confronted, because that's very much what we are dealing with today. Are we dealing with a global order, or are we dealing with a complex web of interactions? Now, let me give the outline. I want briefly to discuss why global governance matters, then speak of the model we have worked with and why it is under retreat, discuss collective action beyond the standard paradigm, and then say a few words about the project that I'm going to start with George Constantino, who is here on the global governance here at the Institute. Presenting that, I must say, you said that already, that it is ambitious, probably overly ambitious, but I thought that, it would be appropriate, being here, to be ambitious and also to draw on the multiplicity of competence, of reflection there is within the Institute, with also other institutes and think tanks we can be in relation with, to think about these issues, and these issues that are developing in a way that is not ordinary these days, and I'm going to present that. Now, why global governance matters? Let me start with the obvious, the degree of interdependence. There was a discussion at some point about whether we had reached or overtaken the degree of interdependence we had before World War I. I think that's passé, very much the discussion. Their degree of interdependence has increased enormously, especially with the global value chains, but also with capital market liberalization, with data, etc. There are disruptions in the making. The digital transformation is fundamentally changing the way international relations develops. There is a potential for further unbundling, to use the words of Richard Baldwin. There is clearly the rise of global commons, which is a new form of interdependence that doesn't take place through flows, through trade, through capital flows, through migration flows, but just by the fact that we are part of the same planet. And finally, and that's not the least, the power shifts we are seeing invite us to think about the way the rise of China, the rise of emerging countries can be accommodated through a global governance system. If you read Graham Allison's book about the avoidance of the Thucydides trap, the war between powers, the system of governance that is put in place, that can be put in place, is part of the answer. It's not the only answer, but can be part of the answer, and that's also a dimension we have to think about. Now, for Europe, global governance matters also enormously, because in part it is so much in accordance with our own way of organizing international relations within the EU. The shaping of globalization is so important for the EU because we think ourselves as a laboratory of global governance, as a laboratory of the way of organizing relations between states, but also because having dismantled barriers to economic interdependence within the EU, at the same time having done it at global level, the definition of the EU as a player in globalization, as an actor with a view on how these international relations should be organized, is part of our identity. So we're a natural advocate of rules-based system in the world. And at the same time, and I think we should recognize that, the EU is a global player and a significant global player. Just to take one example in the news, Mark Zuckerberg declared 2 days ago that the system for data protection that is about to come in force in the EU will be extended by Facebook to all the users worldwide. So this is just an indication that by having rules that are strong, that are significant, we can have an influence at global level. I could have taken also the example of Margarete Vestager and the way she's becoming the regulator of big tech because of the absence of other significant regulator. But market access matters. And because market access matters, we have a significant power. Now, that's why global governance matters in general and for us. Now, the mantra at the time of the global crisis was that a global crisis requires global solutions. And there was very much a belief that the global crisis would be an opportunity for increasing the strength of global governance. If we look back, there was one success, but there have been several setbacks. The success was a response to the global crisis. We avoided protectionism. There were directions taken jointly, especially as regards financial regulation. There was a macro reflation in 2009, one of increase in IMF resources. All that mattered, and all that differed so strongly from the reaction at the time of the Great Recession that it has to be praised. But there have been several setbacks. Setback on trade, setback on the multilateral financial architecture, which is not commensurate to financial globalization, no strong initiative on migration, on cybersecurity, and the Paris Agreement, which is regarded widely as an achievement, is still very much below what was expected a few years ago. So there are disappointments, and this disappointment also contribute to the dissatisfaction with globalization and the fear that globalization is and will remain lopsided. Why? Why? I think we have to confront the fact that there is a change of paradigm, that the approach we had of global governance, which was in the, let's say, 20th century, very much based on a system with one legal regime, legal order, universal membership, and an effective institution. Very much the model that was put forward with the creation of the WTO. In the late 90s, there were a number of attempts. There was the WTO, there was the attempt for the multilateral agreement on investment, there was the attempt with the Kyoto Protocol, there was also the attempt to strengthen the power and the mandate of the IMF. This model, which at that point in time, not by accident in the 90s, at a time when the world got unified, or seemingly so, and there was the thinking that it would be organized with global sectoral institutions and legal regimes. This model didn't reach any success beyond the creation of the WTO. And even the WTO itself, having been created, there was a failure to get more by succeeding in another cycle of multilateral negotiation, and we all know that regionalism has been gaining. Now, there is evidence in this regard of what, in a recent book, Thomas Hale was actually supposed to be coming today, but he's a victim of the strikes, with co-authors, especially David Hull, called the Global Governance Gridlock, with number of setbacks, which they attribute more as political scientists to multipolarity, to inertia, to the nature of problems, to fragmentation. If I try to sort of make sense and give my own reading of the factors behind this gridlock. There are broad economic factors having to do with the way globalization is regarded in advanced countries, in emerging countries. The second thought on real globalization at popular level, with all the dissatisfaction we have seen, but also at government level with and insignificantly, what the US administration is saying about the way globalization has benefited China much more than the US. So a sort of questioning of the regime we've been dealing with for some decades, but also second thoughts in the emerging world with dissatisfaction about financial globalization, about destabilizing capital flows, but also among many emerging countries about the asymmetric opening of services market and the fact that it did not benefit so much from manufacturing development. Manufacturing development was concentrated in a few countries. So, broad economic factors, also the fact that the underlying model in terms of the interdependence is transforming, and I'm going to come back to that. Second set of factors, complexity. I list here a series of sectoral factors, none of which is a sort of, an absolute obstacle to governance, but all of which make it more complex. Diversity of preference, diversity of integration levels, salience of private players, and including when the reasons for joint action, the emergence of global monopolies, the global commons, the power of finance, those are problems that are hard to tackle, and that's the reason why we're facing difficulties with global governance. Finally, I think we should mention geopolitical and political factors. I mentioned why global governance can be an answer to geopolitical tension, can be a way to contain them. But we should also recognize that it was born out of World War II, out of a very deliberate attitude by the US government to organize the free world, to organize a glue, an economic glue for the political coalition there was at the time, that they were ready, the US at the time was ready to commit itself to a number of disciplines as a counterpart to the leadership it benefited from. And so this combination of this, what we could call a sort of anti-Faustian bargain and the common beliefs, that was very much at the core of the system of the post-World War. Now, these attitudes do not prevail anymore in this multipolar world. The US, as I said, is having second thought. China is uncertain to be willing to commit to this kind of virtue that the US committed itself to, not always being faithful to the promise, but still committed. I'm not sure China is committed to it. And other countries are, for different reasons, uncertain about their attitude. So that's the third type of factor. Now, this could lead us to be overly pessimistic, observing that there is unilateralism, there is regionalism, there are clubs, there is complexity, and that the system is becoming more complex, more fragmented, more fragile, that the role of institution has diminished, that the remaining anchor is exclusively political with what remains with the G20 and the role it can play, but that all the system that was in place is unraveling. I think I don't sort of want to be neither pessimistic or optimistic. I don't want to sort of put forward a thesis. What I think we should be doing very much as researchers is to first try to understand what's happening, to try to understand what's going on, and recognize that this complexity there is is full of disappointments, but also full of surprises. So that there is collective action beyond the standard paradigm that we learned to live with after World War II. This paradigm, which I mentioned, the global legal order, the global institution, the universal membership, never fully prevailed in a way. I mean, there was always a special status of the US. It's hard to find a field where you had all three of these dimensions: membership, legal order, institution. If you take of trade, you would hardly say that the WTO is a very effective institution. Pascal Lamy called it medieval. If you speak of global finance, we have a very effective institution with the IMF, but the legal order is weak. Unless you have to apply for assistance, there is not much the IMF can force you to do. And you can go through the various fields, and it's hard to find all three pillars in place anywhere. And even so, the model was not without problems. The model was, being disputed on democratic grounds. Daniel Roderick was here a few weeks ago discussing his views on globalization. There was this questioning on the ability of the system to deal with cross-sectoral issues, the famous trade and, but you could say also finance and, that cross the border or specialized institution. And the politicization of the UN system was also part of the difficulty. Now, is the fact that we're seeing things that do not follow the order, this order, is it a sign of incompleteness, of demise, or also of adaptability? So on the left-hand side of the screen, you have an image of Munich. You recognize certainly. And on the right side is general. And, symmetry, the message is that symmetry and completeness is not necessarily the sign that things are perfectly adapted to the problem you're dealing with. I think we should avoid the Panglossian view that everything is just fine because it's the way it is, but at the same time avoid the temptation of the symmetry of the jardin à la française, as we say, in which everything has to be symmetric and ordered in order to be, to correspond to its needs. There are other templates than neoclassical symmetry. And I would like to drive you through a series of examples quickly to sort of illustrate the way I would wish to think about those issues. The spirit will be very much inspired by Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom received the Nobel Prize for having studied the way coordination problems are addressed, are dealt with at grassroots level through very subtle, complex institutions that do not follow the very simple template, either it's the market or it's the state. She said there's a richness of arrangements in between the state and the market that actually help people deal with issues like water, like fields, like common resources, and that this richness of institutional arrangement has to be explored and has to be understood. And in a way, I would like to use it as an analogy. Now, let me start with an example: bank capital ratios. The banking sector safety is something that has implication for the country taking measures, but also from the country, for the countries, this banking system is in financial relation with. So there is a strong externality involved in aiming at banking sector safety. The simple reasoning would lead you to conclude that for this very reason, there needs to be an enforceable legal order in order for everyone to abide by the rule and to ensure that financial safety is actually implemented. Because part of the effort you're going to make are going to benefit your neighbors, your partners. In fact, the way it works is that we have a committee, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, that sets standards. They're purely indicative, they're purely soft law, and they're implemented through national legislation. And each country or group of countries, in the case of the EU, implement them through its national legislation. Now, why is it that it works? And the graphs indicate that it has worked in terms of raising capital ratios. The reason is that there has been a political endorsement by the G20. There have been political reasons for respond to the popular uproar about the financial follies of the 2000. But also that there has been a combination of reputational incentives and market punishment for countries or not complying that has led virtually everyone to make efforts towards complying with the Basel standards. So we've had a system of indicative standards, a very thorough compliance assessment procedure. So the Basel Committee assesses what actually national regulators do. There's a transparent and frequent assessment of the situation. And this combination of soft law assessment, rigorous assessment, and market pressure is delivering more than what you would have spontaneously thought looking at the problem and saying, there is a collective action problem, this requires a sort of universal legal order. So first example. Second example, taxation. Taxation is a field where it looked almost impossible to achieve anything because taxation is at the core of national sovereignty. So there is no global authority to speak of. There is, in the EU, we have unanimity for taxation, and actually we haven't achieved much in terms of tax coordination. And you had diverging interests from large and small countries. Large countries wanting to keep their tax revenues, small countries playing non-cooperative games, either because they could provide tax shelters with very low taxation, or even tax havens for jurisdictions here and there, providing tax havens to individuals and corporations. Now, you could, and I would certainly say, that we're not at the end of the road by far. But still, something has been achieved. We have now an automatic multilateral exchange of information between banks for individuals. We have the first step towards an anti-abuse convention that is going to enter into force in a few weeks. It's not very ambitious. It's not about transfer pricing. There's massive tax avoidance. But nevertheless, it's a first step towards a multilateral response to this issue. Now, why is it that it could happen? It's interesting because no institution was really ready to take responsibility for it. Within the EU, the unanimity rule was not making it possible. Within the OECD, it was the same. Switzerland was able to block, and with a few allies, was able to block everything ambitious within the OECD. Now, what happened is that the G20, which is a collection of large countries without tax havens, with sort of few exceptions, the G20 actually requested the OECD to work on it. And that by using the Secretariat of the OECD and creating ad hoc groupings for putting pressure on tax havens, this was eventually a way to reach a solution. So I'm mentioning it because it was a combination of political pressure, the G20 serving as a sort of political push for it, the OECD serving as the secretariat. So it was nothing of the sort of global organization, legal order, but nevertheless has delivered something. The third, and perhaps the most interesting, is climate. The standard approach, and actually, many economists wrote about it, was that in order to fight climate change, there needs to be a system with rigorous, strict, either cap and trade system or a common price of carbon, but something that's mandatory for everyone because of the temptation to play non-cooperative game, because of the massive externalities there is, the prisoner's dilemma structure of the game, and therefore all economists advocated either one or the other solution, but with a form of compulsion. Now, this was tried with the Kyoto Protocol, and this has failed. Now, the Paris Agreement does not solve any of these challenges. The Paris Agreement is full of insufficiencies, both in terms of quantity, the intended contribution, in terms of assessment, in terms of enforcement. And someone like Jean Tirole criticized very strongly the Paris Agreement, saying little tangible has been acted upon, and that the promises are incomparable, they are insufficient, they would be costly if implemented, and they will never be implemented fully anyway. Now, the observers still consider that Paris Agreement has changed something. Why? It's not, you can't understand in a static model. If you want to understand what has changed, you have to take on board the fact that there is behind this climate issue, there is a technological issue. There is a horse race between what Philippe Aghion and others and Daron Acemoglu have called the race between dirty and clean technology. And dirty technology is much more advanced because dirty technology for decades has been developing and productivity has developed in dirty technologies. Now the question is, can we reach a threshold at which there is value in investing in the clean technology, and the clean technology is making sufficient progress so that it's becoming competitive? And in fact, what's happening with the Paris Agreement is not at all, cannot be understood with the traditional model. It has to be understood with a model that puts technology and dynamic increasing returns at the core of the functioning of the Paris Agreement. And the fact that at some point private players have to bet on the clean technology because they cannot afford to take the risk of being invested in the dirty technology if the clean technology is, in fact, going to gain and to become the superior technology. And this sort of combination of public players actually at different level, state and non-state, cities, regions, etc., public opinion and private interest is at the core of what is at stake there. We don't know if it's going to deliver eventually or not, but there is certainly something interesting to look at, and the way it moves, is really based on something completely different from the traditional model. Now, just to summarize, here is my three examples, and how they work. And I think what you find in each and every of them is sort of a role of the epistemic community, a role of the people who contribute in making the case, in demonstrating the case for action, a combination with public opinion pressure, public political endorsement, at least in two cases by the G20, played a strong role. Market pressure, at least in two cases, not so much in the case of taxation. And a play with the membership and the institution they are, so a sort of different combination than the standard combination. Now, what I want to avoid is to be pictured as the one who thinks that everything is fine. Let me just give you two examples of things where things are not fine. One is global financial safety nets. the rationale in a liberalized capital market world for global safety nets is very strong. In other words, for having the IMF at the center, for having facilities that are conditional, but also liquidity facilities for countries that are in relatively good shape but suffer from sudden capital outflows. So this has been repeated and repeated. What we're seeing is just the opposite. We're seeing that the graph above, self-insurance, country accumulating reserves on their own because they don't trust the IMF. Very much started after the financial crisis in Asia in the late 90s, driven by Asia. And at the bottom, what you see is a network of bilateral agreements, swap agreements, on the part of the US, on the part of China, on the part regionally of Japan and the EU. So something that departs very strongly from the multilateral system that we, the economists, tend to regard as superior. Why? For a combination of reasons. First, IMF resources have not been increased, and IMF responsibilities have not been increased, so that's members would refrain from doing it. Borrowers have refrained from or retreated from the multilateral solution, or would be borrowers with the accumulation of reserves. And creditors are increasingly also playing the political game of having their clients to whom they can lend or with whom they can provide swap lines. So that's hard to be very positive or optimistic about the way things have developed in this field. Last field I want to sort of mention briefly, internet governance. That's a very different type of field. That's a field where things started in a completely different way, without an institution, obviously, without legal order, with very much something organized around multiple stakeholders, a very strong role of private players, and a system of consultation around ICANN, around the Internet Governance Forum, that initially looked like something that could be effective and flexible. Now it's confronted with major challenges. One is competition, where that was a sort of world of small players is turning into a world of large monopolies. One is fragmentation for various reasons, for reasons having to do with preferences. The way Germany deals with issues of hate speech is not the way the US deals with hate speech, and there are preferences, deep reasons for the difference in preferences. One is the way China has chosen to develop the internet as a closed system, and new issues that are burgeoning, increasingly difficult to deal with, and for which the system of governance looks increasingly ill-equipped. It may unravel because the system there is very weak. ICANN has a very narrow role, and if you look at the Internet Governance Forum, I just checked because I didn't know much of it. While the mandate is incredibly, fuzzy, discuss, facilitate, interface, for inform and inspire. So no negotiation, no decision of whatever sort. All stakeholders are equal. There is no standing secretariat. There are barely publications. The website looks like a website of the 1990s. For the Internet Governance Forum is not promising. The idea that these institutions have any ability to deal with the problems we're facing is just ridiculous. The fact is that it's not working, and we're facing the risk of overall fragmentation. So that concludes my examples, and let me now, and it's time for it to move to the final point. What I would wish, and what we would wish to take from that, and what the project we would wish to work on. The idea is to sort of, I give these examples to illustrate it. The idea is to try to understand and try to develop a framework for understanding what works and why. So if I take as a sort of basis that neoclassical architecture is not the way forward, there needs to be a grid for analyzing the issues in various fields, how they can be looked at, how the problems can be identified, how solutions can be mapped into problems. And here, the approach to understand what works and what doesn't cannot be limited to a single field. I mean, as economists, I would sort of propose a number of tools we economists have developed to analyze such problems. But there are other dimensions that clearly do not belong to the field of economic analysis. I think law, history, political science, and international relations, which have made good progress in understanding. I was mentioning this work of people at Oxford. They've made good progress in understanding these new developments. So I think we have to combine all that. And again, to go back to Elinor Ostrom, the idea is to sort of to get to the building blocks, to understand, to come up with something that's not a series of sector-specific stories, but something that helps single out building blocks and components that help understand whether they are less models, less system of interaction than they are fields and examples we can develop. In doing so, the difficulty is that you have to avoid the sort of being lost in detail. Just to go back to what I said about Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, there are zillions of detail in this world. So you have to avoid being lost in detail, but you have to avoid using oversimplified models. I think, just to give an example, the prisoner's dilemma model, which is very much used in to explain students what's the structure of collective action problem, is not necessarily always the right one. And by using it as a metaphor for a wider set of problems, you may lead people to believe that any collective action raises the same type of problem, and any sort of Nash equilibrium is of the same nature and leads to the same sort of incentive to no compliance or no participation. So there are other examples of cooperative games that have a different structure and lead to different conclusions. And I think behind what I said about some of the interactions at play in certain fields, there are different games. So you have to be careful, to be parsimonious in terms of the model you're using, but at the same time not to pretend that each and every problem is of the same nature. The way you can look at those things are what I've simplified is this diagram. There, in the middle you have the players and the interactions. The players are who matters in a given field, who matters for climate, and who matters for biodiversity, and who matters for financial regulation, and who matters for global competition. They're not the same. The degree of concentration is not the same. The homogeneity is not the same. So it's important to start from the identification of the players and their degree of diversity. And then it's important to look at the game structure, the type of interaction there is, and also not only in static terms, as I said, but also in dynamic terms, the way the time dimension enters. With technical progress, with irreversibility, with risk, all these dimensions also have to be taken on board. And then those are the middle sort of blocks, and then you have the bottom and the top blocks. One is attributes, so what sort of underlying the approach to these problems, and one in institutions with their membership, with their rules, with their abilities to provide assessment, to enforce, etc. And I think that sort of the political scientists, international relation people, they think more in terms of attributes and players, and they're better probably at determining what is the role of these factors. Economists tend to look more at interaction in institutions, simplifying issues having to do with the players, and sort of disregarding the issue of attributes and the beliefs, the knowledge and political dimensions, commitment and trust. So I think we have to bring on board all the dimensions. So just to end on that, what does it mean? It means identifying the collective action coordinates, what the players and what their interactions. That's very much what I just said in terms of the middle blocks in my diagram, and then also analyze the coordinates of effectiveness having to do with the sort of underlying factors, which attributes is a word that Ostrom uses, and institutions and the way they work. That's a very rough, at this stage, program for research. What I think is that we should be testing it with various type of issues, various type of problems, and very much the type of agenda we want to develop to go quite precisely into the analysis of the various fields in which it's important to analyze what's happening with global governance, how it is developed, what are the solutions that are tried, what are the solutions that are put in place, what has succeeded and what has failed, so to have a sort of common framework for analyzing it, and in the process, obviously, to refine and develop this framework. Let me end on a bigger question, which is taken again from a quote from Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa. All that is fine. All that, what I've suggested, I think can be a useful, important, enlightening research agenda, if successful. Nevertheless, we shouldn't forget that there is something beyond, and this something is the political order. Tommaso, both in 2005, when speaking at the Basel Committee, and in his book in 2009, emphasized this political dimension and emphasized the issue of the spirit of cooperation that exists or not. These particular arrangements, and very much when he speaks of the pre-1914 world, this web of specific technical arrangements that organize international cooperation, but in the absence of a political order, what he said, speaking in 2005, is that there was not something strong enough to sustain these arrangements, and that these arrangements, they cannot flourish in a vacuum. There are minimal conditions that are required to make them sustainable in the presence of unavoidable tensions. And again, in a fairly pessimistic way, in his last book, he emphasized that we cannot be certain that the lessons of the pre-1914 world have been learned. So that's a bigger question. That's a question I'm not going to address in this research agenda, but the question I think we should not forget. Let me end here.